I'm David Corey. I'm director of Baylor in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you all for coming out. It's really nice to see so many people face-to-face here. And I thank you for supporting this event and my colleague, Beth Barr. I want to mention a couple of co-sponsors who have helped make tonight possible. And one of them is Denver Seminary. They have a Washington, D.C. campus. Deborah Barr is here, and she has a table out there with some information that you can pick up about Denver Seminary in D.C. I want to thank the Brazos Press, who published the book. Brazos Press also paid for your wine. So we want to make sure to say thank you. Cheers to Brazos Press. I want to thank the Chautauqua Institution, who is co-sponsoring this event. They're headquartered in Chautauqua, New York, but they have a presence here in D.C. as well as in New York. Their president, Michael Hill, is here. I met him tonight, and I want to thank him for coming and for supporting this event. Their director of programming, Deborah Moore, is here. She's a dear friend from college, and it's just so great to partner with the Chautauqua Institution. And then, make sure that I'm not missing anything. These are very important, consequential things. Lastly, before introducing Beth, I want to say that Baylor's provost is here. This is Nancy Brickhouse. Nancy Brickhouse has been a faithful supporter of Baylor in Washington since we started about 5 years ago, and we're grateful that she's here. And now for Beth Barr, you know who she is because you came here to hear her book presentation. On your program, if you turn it over, you can see her biography. I only want to stress two things from that bio. The first is that she's not only a Baylor professor, where she's my colleague, but she was a Baylor undergraduate. So she's got Baylor running through the veins. She went on to do her Ph.D. in medieval history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I want to point you to the Anxious Bench, which is a religious history blog that you can find on Patheos, where she contributes pieces, as well as she contributes pieces to venues like Christianity Today and the Washington Post. After she speaks, my colleague Matthew Lee Anderson will ask a few questions to her in dialogue fashion, and then we'll open it up to all you to ask questions that you would like to ask. So again, thank you for coming. Beth? You can clap.
Well, thank you for coming. My daughter always asks me, I have an 11-year-old daughter who is rather on the opinionated side, which you might not be surprised about. But she always asks me, in fact, she asked me this while I was writing the book, and she always asks me before I go and do something. She says, Mom, it had better be worth it. So I will be happy to tell her that this was worth it. So thank you all for coming. I thought tonight that I would, because I know some of you have read the book, some of you have not read the book, and some of you might have questions about why I wrote the book. So I thought tonight that's what I would talk about why I wrote the book, and it'll also give you a little bit of an introduction to what's in the book for those of you who have not yet read it. So the title for my talk is The Cost of Not Writing the Making of Biblical Womanhood. It sat at the end of our counter for almost a week, beginning of school notices for carpool and parent meetings, along with the odd mail that never seems to have a place, piled on the stapled manila pages. Occasionally I would pick it up, shake off the mail, and look at it. It was from Brazos Press, who bought the wine. We had been discussing a new book project for several months, tentatively titled The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And this was the official contract. Are you going to sign that? My husband would ask. His words were familiar by now, recycled in my own thoughts. I think so, I would answer. But I really wasn't sure. I really wasn't sure if I wanted to write it. I wasn't sure if the cost would be worth it. Would it be worth it if I was accused of not believing the Bible? I knew the very premise that the belief God calls men to lead and women to follow isn't the scriptural mandate evangelicals think it is. Or put more simply, biblical womanhood isn't biblical. I knew this very premise would raise questions about my orthodoxy. I knew the unusual approach, historical evidence blended with personal experience, had the potential to be powerful precisely because it required vulnerability. Would it be worth it if my identity as a scholar was questioned because of my identity as a Christian? Would it be worth it for so many people to know the hardest parts of my life? And so I let the contract sit for several days at the end of my counter. It wasn't gathering dust. It was gathering my fears and a little bit of Mel. My worries were understandable. Indeed, for those of you who follow me on Twitter, you know that all the things I have feared have come to pass. Yet, as I stand here, more than 2 years after I signed that contract, and almost 8 months after publication, I realized I had been worrying about the wrong things. Instead of worrying about the cost of writing, I should have worried more about the cost of not writing. So let me explain. In the final chapter of the Making of Biblical Womanhood, I share the story of a woman named Christine de Pizan. She's a 15th century widow who supported her family as a professional writer. She wrote poetry, devotional religious texts, and a biography of the deceased French king Charles V, commissioned by his brother Philip of Burgundy. Her most famous work, however, involves her response to a literary text called The Romance of the Rose. Composed by 2 different authors between 1228 and 1270, it is an allegory of love about a young man questing after a rosebud. And I usually just tell my students to use their imagination. It is highly misogynistic. For example, in one section, it warns against marriage because a wife will ruin your life. Marriage is, quote, a life too full of torment and strife and riotousness because of the pride of foolish women. Not to mention the, quote, dangers and reproaches which they do and say with their mouths and requests and complaints which they invent on many occasions. It takes great effort to keep women and hold back their foolish wills. C.S. Lewis once described The Romance of the Rose as one of the most popular, vulgar texts ever written. I often wonder what he would say about 50 Shades of Grey. But anyway, Christine de Pizan was incensed by the popularity of the text. In fact, today she is most well known for her response to it. She wrote a series of letters attacking it in which she won the support of the Chancellor of the University of Paris. She then wrote a lengthy prose response countering The Romance of the Rose. Some of you might have read it. It's called The Treasure of the City of Ladies, or The Book of the City of Ladies. Christine de Pizan understood that misogynist ideas were dangerous because they hurt real women. So she countered them with an alternate narrative constructed from the lives of famous women throughout history who had made valuable contributions to society. This is how I explain the power of what Christine did in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. Ideas matter. Ideas that depict women as less than men influence men to treat women as less than men. Ideas that objectify women result in women being treated like objects. So it's not any surprise that Paige Patterson, one of the leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention conservative resurgence, who commented on the body of a 16-year-old girl to a crowd of Christians, resulting in their laughs and applause, shares the same understanding of women's roles as the conservative Baptist churches involved in the sexual abuse of hundreds of women, as chronicled by the Houston Chronicle. Christine de Pizan, more than 600 years ago, understood this too. She understood that ideas about women matter. She understood so well that she connected the ideas presented in The Romance of the Rose to the circumstances of an unnamed woman who was trapped in an abusive marriage. As Christine describes, a married man believed in The Romance of the Rose as in the gospel. I really like how she phrased that. This was an extremely jealous man who, whenever in the grip of passion, would go and find the book and read it to his wife, Then he would become violent and strike her and say such horrible things as, "These are the kind of tricks you pull on me. This good, wise text knew well what women are capable of." And at every word he finds appropriate, he gives her a couple of kicks or slaps. Thus it seems clear to me that whatever other people think of this book, this poor woman pays too high a price. Christine fought for this woman by fighting against the ideas that hurt her. As a Christian woman who grew up in the Southern Baptist world, I agree with Christine de Pizan. She realized that at the root of abusive behavior towards women, physical, emotional, psychological, economic, lay misogynistic ideas about women. She realized that misogyny hurts all of us, whether we recognize it or not. And it especially hurts those already marginalized by economics, education, race, and even religion. Christine used what she had to fight against that misogyny, to love those whom God loves, to help make the lives of women better, even the life of that poor woman who pays too high a price. Christine realized that to change the lives of women, she first had to change ideas about women, which is really the heart of the Making of Biblical Womanhood. For too long, conservative evangelicals have taught a narrative about women which they believe is rooted in the gospel and they believe is supported by the facts of history. A narrative that places women permanently under male authority. Now, I can guess what some of you might be thinking. Most men don't treat women this way. The problem isn't God's plan for marriage, but rather the sin of people within those marriages, right? It's bad people, not the system. I don't think so. I contend that no matter how much we want to separate the evangelical vision of male headship and female submission from the general patriarchy of our world, we simply can't, because they aren't any different. As I explain in the first chapter of my book, both systems place power in the hands of men and take power away from women. Both systems teach men that women rank lower than they do. Have y'all been listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast? Okay. Both systems teach women that their voices are worth less than the voices of men. Once again, have you listened to that podcast? Just think about it. If men, simply because of their sex, have the potential to preach and exercise spiritual authority over a church congregation, but women, simply because of their sex, do not, then that gives men, in general, authority over women in general. I still remember the moment I grasped this reality. I was sitting in our high school youth room. The walls were red and yellow, which the youth had chosen and always reminded me of a hot dog. But my husband was going through a How to Teach series, and he'd asked one of the young women, to lead that night. However, because she was a woman, and because we were at a complementarian church, he had to justify why he was able to do that. As I listened to him, I realized that all those young men in the room were being taught that there was something innate in their masculinity that made them able to lead in a way that the young woman never could. Not because of their character, or because of their skill set, or even because of how God had called them, but simply because their body was male. I also realized that the limits placed on that young woman by our church would spill over into her everyday everyday life, especially in southern Texas. You see, Christian patriarchy does not remain confined within the walls of our homes. It does not stay behind our pulpits. It cannot be peeled off suit coats like a name tag as evangelical men move from denying women's leadership at church to accepting the authority of women at work or in the classroom. Complementarians may argue that women are equal to men, as does the Southern Baptist Convention's 1998 amendment to the Baptist Faith and Message. Yet their insistence that equal work manifests in unequal roles refutes this. Take, for example, women's work. I'm a social historian, so I like to talk about work. We may claim that women's work, from house care to child care to answering phones, is valuable and worthy. But when that same work is deemed unsuitable for a man to do, it reveals the truth. Women's work is valued less than men's work. Moreover, just as men are demeaned for doing women's work, which often comes with less authority and consequently lower pay, women are restricted from doing men's jobs, which garner both more authority and higher pay. Would you believe that the current pay gap between women in our modern world, roughly 75 cents to every dollar that a man earns, is almost exactly the same as the pay gap between women and men in medieval Europe? Talk about a patriarchal equilibrium. We keep trying to argue that Christian patriarchy values women in the same ways as men, but the hard evidence of history shows us that it does not. While social media has buzzed with very public attempts to refute my argument, mostly by white, conservative, evangelical men whose identity is wrapped up in the power of a rigid gender hierarchy. And I won't call any names, but you can go look them up. While social media has buzzed with these public attempts to refute me, behind the scenes, my direct messages on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as my email, has buzzed with letters from women. It has been 34 weeks since the book released. That's 238 days. Would you believe it if I told you that every single one of those days I've received at least one letter, usually multiple letters every day, from women and men telling me how the book has changed their lives. Some of the letters come with gifts. I never knew how creative people were. Sometimes just books that people want me to read, or sometimes more creative things like knitted washcloths in the color scheme of the book cover. Or even, and this one I just received, and it came in an envelope that was cut out of Wonder Woman comic strips. And it was a little green plastic toy soldier. The soldier had a tiny sign over the cannon he was shooting that simply read, "The Patriarchy." I have it on my desk. But mostly, the letters are just words, arriving from all over the world. And what they tell me is radically different than what the leaders of the complementarian movement are saying. Just this week, I received a letter from a woman in Beijing, China. Her pastor, who is also a professor, sent the letter for her. He contacted me through both email and Twitter, trying to make sure the letter would reach me. He told me she was a student in his class who read The Making of Biblical Womanhood for her research project. He said the impact that it had on her was profound, and he wanted me to hear her. Listen to some of what she wrote, and I'm keeping it anonymous for obvious reasons, and I'm also keeping in her words, which aren't always smooth. Dr. Barr, when I was reading your book, I was crying almost in every chapter. It's such a shocking realization how deep the patriarchal system is poisoning Christians' worldview and has let Christianity become a weapon towards women. I suddenly found that I had lost the joy of finding Jesus in my life after staying in the Christian church for so many years. I took in the headship of men doctrine and persuaded myself again and again that it was me who was the problem. Thankfully, I got the chance to read your book, and I'm finding my Jesus again, who is actually for me and not against me, who is for the women, not against women. And my fear towards marriage is gone because I realized that I was believing a wrong thing between men and women, which is the patriarchy. I like that. And it should be something we fight against as followers of Christ. Thank you for speaking up and choosing not to stay silent. As much as the Making of Biblical Womanhood speaks from the experiences of women, its evidence is grounded in history and theology. In fact, its evidence is grounded in history and theology that has been written for decades that shows how wrong the narrative of biblical womanhood is. What the Making of Biblical Womanhood argues is that rather than making us different from the world, Christian patriarchy makes us look just like everyone else. Of course, on the morning of August 6, 2019, I had no way of knowing what would happen. I was still afraid about the personal cost to me. I remember watching my daughter as she sat at the kitchen bar eating a chocolate chip muffin. That's the only way I can get her to eat anything healthy, which those of you who follow me on Instagram know was shaped like a Star Wars character. That's true. I remember my son also wandered into the kitchen, sleep still blearing his eyes. And it was at that moment, as I looked at my children on that very normal morning, that I realized the cost of writing The Making of Biblical Womanhood would be worth it. Because it wasn't about me. It was about my children. It was about the women I had taught and mentored for so many years. It was about the women in my evangelical world who, in the words of Christine de Pizan, paid too high a price for dangerous ideas held about them. It was about this young woman in China who cried her way through every chapter. I signed the contract for The Making of Biblical Womanhood because I realized the cost to me was small compared to the good it could do for the evangelical world. I realized that the cost of not speaking up for women, of allowing the status quo to remain unchallenged, would be far greater than the cost of staying silent. So thank you all for coming and hearing me tonight.
They are
they
working.
on?
They are. Mine is.
I don't know if mine is mine.
It is. We're good. All right.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for that talk, and thank you for the book as
Yeah,
well.
thank you.
I think it was both are, I think, as the kids would say, spicy. I don't know about how you feel, but when I teach classes, I try to pick up some new youthisms every term, and I've learned this youthism.
The word spicy?
The word spicy, yeah. So I'm trying to
Yeah.
use this in as much.
I don't know if any of my graduate students use that this semester. I don't know. One of them's back in the corner, so she know.
Spicy, yeah. So there it is. Well, thank you for that. So I just have a few questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience for you all to ask questions as well. So first off, I really appreciated how you framed in your talk the role of the dangerous decision, as it were, to include your own experiences. And as you said, it would require a real level of vulnerability. Talk us through why you decided to do that, knowing that the stakes were going to be that high. There's a real choice point to make as a writer there. Why did you decide to make that particular choice?
That's a very good question. For those of you who do follow me on Twitter, and I'm friends with Kristen Dumais, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and she actually referenced a meeting that we had in January 2020 in which I told her that I was going to include my personal narrative. And she had finished Jesus and John Wayne, and I was telling her that my book was going to be different because I had chosen to include my personal narrative. And it was a conscious choice. One of the reasons I did it, I'd already done it some, writing on the anxious bench, and so I'd already put some things out there. And so that makes it easier when you've already done it a little bit. But the other reason was because, and this was something that Kristen and I talked about, Kristen was writing a purely historical monograph. She was writing to academics. It's really who her audience was. That's why she went with a press that was a more popular trade press, but it was still geared towards academics. I wasn't writing to academics. I was writing to the women in my Sunday school class. And as an evangelical, our language is testimony. That's how we communicate. Why? That's one of the things that we're taught very early on is how do we tell our testimony to people? And I'll tell you, I was doing a talk with Frank Schaeffer. I don't know if y'all know him, Francis Schaeffer's son. And in the middle of my live interview with him, he asked me why I still believed in Jesus. So I was really thankful for all of that early preparation and giving my testimony. It was fun. But
You can do that here if you want. I mean,
you can all go listen to my talk with Frank Schaeffer. Yeah, it was a really good talk too. But that's why I knew that's the language that we speak in. That's why we believe. It's not just the evidence. It's how the evidence has affected us. And so that was really the turning point because I realized that if I wanted people to hear me, I had to speak in a language that they would hear. So that was it.
That's helpful. So, and that leads into my next question. The opening line of your book is a really striking one. I never expected to be an activist.
Yeah.
And I think you touched on this a little in terms of talking about who this book is for. But go one step farther back for us. How do you think about the relationship between scholarship and activism in general, not only in this book, but as a part of your vocation as a Christian academic, as it's displayed here?
You know, what's interesting is while I was writing that January 2020, apparently that was a momentous month, I was at the American Historical Association, and I was on a panel with several other historians, including one from Yale, as well as Jamar Tisby, who some of you may know. Kristen was also on that panel, and the panel was on history as activism. Heath Carter at Princeton was the one who had organized it. And so the conversation we were having was, as historians, is this something we should be doing? And there's a lot of varying opinion about history as activism. But from my perspective, history's always been activist in some ways because it tells a narrative about why people are the way they are that it wants you to believe. And it's crafted from evidence. It's always based on evidence. It should be always based on evidence. But it is, in some ways, it is convincing, you know, this is why we are this way. This is why this thing happened. Which in some ways is a natural connection to activism because activism, I think, takes one further step. It's not only why we are this way, but what can we do to change that? And the person who inspired me towards activism was actually Jamar Tisby. It was not at this January 2020 conference. It was actually at the Conference on Faith and History, which I just now stepped down as president. I was president for a year longer than I should have been because of COVID. But it was at a conference that I had organized in 2018, and I had invited him as one of the plenary speakers. And he gave a talk there on why he had become an activist, why he was choosing to use history to help change the conversation about Black people, especially in the Christian church. And I remember listening to him, and I remember also seeing the reaction of all of those students, because it was an undergraduate plenary, who were listening to him. And I realized that his words were connecting with them in a meaningful way. And I also began to see that not only were his words connecting with those students, but his words were connecting with churches. And people were listening to him about how racism had been complicit in the church from really the very beginning in the U.S., especially in the Southern church. And in order for us to uproot it, we had to recognize it. And the only way to recognize it was to get people to understand. That's what historical activism is. It's getting people to understand, to recognize why a system is the way that it is, and then pointing a path forward for what we can do. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Can I ask some about the limits?
Plus, I'm a feminist historian, and feminism is always political.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
The personal is political, so that was a natural step, too.
Yeah, which is tied to also the reasons for bringing experience into the
Yes.
book
Part
explicitly,
of feminist
right?
theory is using, Christina knows this because she just read it, is storytelling as part of feminist theory. So it's actually a methodology that's been used.
Yeah, good. So let me ask some about maybe the limits of that history as activism project, because I noticed in your book you cited Jamar, and Jamar's line about how racism has always been present, it's just adapted, it's sort of shape-shifted, as it were. And you say something similar about patriarchy, which leads me to this sort of question. It's something like, if Christian patriarchy is this powerful of a force, such that it's constantly shifting and it's been present in every generation, is telling a narrative sufficient to root it out? Or what sort of therapeutic would we actually, do we need to correct this force, given the historical narrative that you tell? Is the activism going to be enough here?
So that's a very good question. In fact, I get that question all the time. People are like, what do I do now? I get that it's like, what do I do now? And on the one hand, the starting point is helping people recognize that this needs to change. That's it. Ideas matter. And we really got to help people recognize that these ideas matter. And even if these ideas about male headship and female submission, most people, it works out okay, because most people are decent people. The problem, though, is you always have to follow your theology to its logical conclusion. And the logical conclusion of complementarianism is that women rank lower than men. And that when that mindset is taught, it seems a no-brainer to understand why we have so many problems in the church because of that. So anyway, on the one hand, I do think that changing ideas is helpful. I think if we can change ideas, because on the one hand, changing ideas, what we've got to do in churches is we have to get people to realize that to grapple with this problem, to start grappling with theology and realizing there's a different way to read these texts. That was my whole chapter 2. And one person actually noted, they said, you didn't really say anything new in chapter 2. And I said, I know. I didn't. I said what people have been saying for decades. But the response to chapter 2 has been amazing because evangelicals don't know it. They don't know those scholars. They don't know that. In fact, one of my favorite emails I got a couple of weeks ago was from David Odell Scott, who's the guy who wrote that original article about 1 Corinthians 14, where he said this is a Corinthian quotation. And he reached out. He had finally, one of his former graduate students had reached out to him and sent him my book, and he wrote me back. And it was funny because he thought he was telling me something new. But he said, the first person who ever really picked up my idea and started publishing on it was a guy named Charles Talbert. And he said, did you know Charles Talbert? And for those of you who don't know, Charles Talbert was a great professor at Baylor. And I actually worked with him. And he's actually the one who introduced me to David Odell Scott's article. And he just passed away the week of Thanksgiving. So that was I thought that what a small world that this is. But so I think by helping people realize there's more to the story, that they have not been told the whole story, that can help lead to structural changes. So I didn't provide a practical layout on how to roll this out in churches, but so you're laughing. I mean, I was just like, stop doing it. But I think one of the things to do is just to start putting women in leadership positions in churches. And I was on a podcast with Kristen Dumais and Amy Bird and Michael Bird, and in it I was asked this question. And I said, well, the best thing to do is to put women in adult Sunday school classes. Let them teach. Because once people start seeing women teach, they're like, whoa, women can teach. And I'm actually learning stuff from them. And this is good. And then you start like putting them in front of the church. And then you start putting women to preach. And you know, once you hear a woman who's really called preach, it's really hard to say that women can't preach. I mean, it's really, I don't know, it's a changing experience. I was on a podcast too with a black female preacher, and I was just astonished by the time I got to the end. I was like, that woman is a preacher. And then it was funny because Denny Burke, who doesn't like me, he said it was my secret plan to end complementarianism, and I was like, well, I don't know if it's secret. I was like, but it is my plan for women to teach. So does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Moving on. Within that story that you tell, you're a medieval historian, especially, right? And while on the one side you take the Jamar Tisby sort of line of sort of shape-shifting, the medievals come off actually kind of well. like there's some resources there, it seems like, that you tap into. What is it about that period? Do you think that period is a particularly fertile period for reflection?
Yes, I'm a medievalist.
Good. So my follow-up was going to be why? What is it about that period? And was I right to think that they came off a little bit better than some others?
So actually yesterday, a very good medievalist who also has a very large Twitter following, his name is David Perry. And he just published a new book on the history of the Middle Ages, and it's called The Bright Ages. And I really like that title because, instead of the Dark Ages. And so I love that. And he's clearly, a medievalist. So medievalists are a little sensitive about the way that the medieval world is portrayed. But at the same time, in the evangelical world, we skip medieval history. We go from, or we pretend that Augustine is medieval or Boethius, we pretend that they're medieval. And then we skip to Thomas Aquinas, and we think Thomas Aquinas is a lot more important than, he got really important in the 19th century, and he was some Eucharistic theology. There were some important things that Thomas Aquinas did, but in the whole framework of the medieval world, he's one man. But he sort of becomes the idea that everybody holds on to, and then we jump to the Reformation, and that's pretty much it. That's medieval history in a nutshell, especially in evangelical things. And one of the books, I can't remember which one now, but I surveyed the indexes of a lot of church history textbooks, and it was really depressing because one of them I like, oh, there's 13 women in here, and then I realized that 6 of them were the wives of Henry VIII. I was like, anyway, so it's just sad. And so it's not that, and this is, something the Reformation chapter was probably the chapter I sweated over the most, because I have a lot of friends who are Reformationists, and I didn't want them all running after me, because, this idea that, because the Reformation it's often seen as a victory for Protestants. And what we don't realize is there are always gains and losses with every change in history. So it's not that the Reformation was bad for women and the medieval world was good for women. It's that patriarchy was different. And I think what evangelicals don't understand is that the medieval world had a loophole, I call it the loophole, that allowed women to have religious authority that went away with the Reformation. Now, the other side of that coin is that in the medieval world, the lowest rung you could be was a married woman with children because you were sexually active. After the Reformation, that becomes the best thing you can be. So gains and losses. It was kind of nice to elevate wives who had been at the bottom of the totem pole, and most women are wives, at least in the medieval world, for some part of their life. So that was a good thing for women, but at the same time, it came with the loss of this loophole that allowed women to have religious authority. Yeah. So yes, I do think it's a very fruitful period.
Yeah, that's really helpful. As a special lover of the wife of Bath, actually.
I didn't know that.
I was a little disappointed to see that she didn't feature more prominently.
I am a medievalist. I'm a social historian. I work on medieval sermons, and I learned a long time ago that I did not want to tangle with Chaucer historians, with Chaucer scholars. So I very rarely get into Chaucer because that's its own thing.
Yeah, my very weird line is that I think the wife of Bath in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is one of the best exegetes that the medieval period produced.
It is.
She's a proper Augustinian who just nails Augustine's theology of marriage. Like, it just says what Augustine says.
The other thing is that Chaucer also...
Sorry, I'm totally geeking out now. This is not what you're here for. I recognize that.
The other thing that Chaucer actually does, and I've used this because it's very minor and nobody's going to get after me, but Chaucer quotes, and this is the wife of Bath, who quotes the woman of Canaan.
Yeah.
And the woman of Canaan, the story of the woman of Canaan, the story where Jesus, this woman, follows after him, and the disciples tell her to go away and not to listen to her. And she calls out to Jesus, and Jesus says, why should I listen to you? You're from the people who eat essentially you're the dogs that eat the food. And it was a racial slur, whatever your evangelical pastor told you, it was a racial slur. Jesus called her a bad name and said, this is who you are. And the woman essentially said, yes, but essentially, what she said is, the gospel is still for us too. You are still for us too. And Jesus looked at her and said, you are right. And in the medieval world, that was a very prominent teaching text. And it was a text. It was in the liturgy. It came up all the time. In fact, my monograph, my academic book that I sort of put on hold while I finished this, and now I'm going to finish it, at one time I actually had called it The Woman of Canaan in the medieval world because she's so prominent in medieval scripture. And the story that we learn there, the way medieval people interpreted this, is that Jesus stopped and heard the words of a woman over the words of men, and that the woman's faith was greater than the faith of the disciples. And the way we hear that story today is very different. Yeah. And so it's just showing, anyway. I won't geek out anymore.
Thank you for turning that into something constructive. I'm getting text
the wife of Bath quote.
Yeah,
so
my boss is texting me saying maybe one more question. So I think I've lost her faith. So I noticed there isn't a lot in this book about race, though you do mention it.
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that question.
And so I'm just curious to hear you reflect on the racialized dimension of this phenomenon. Did you think about doing more with that? Reflect on that for us, because it's there, but it's very
you
minor
asked
thing.
what was on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
That chapter was on the cutting room floor. I did. I wanted to talk a whole lot more about race because I think racism and patriarchy cannot be separated. They are part of the interlocking structures of oppression. And I mean, they make sense together because when you teach people that there is something about the way they are born that makes them have the right to rule over other people, that's racism. It's patriarchy. I mean, they're the same thing, which is why I also think that racism is so... One of the reasons we can't get rid of racism is because we're not letting go of patriarchy either. Because I mean, at the core, it's the same lesson that some people are created by God over other people. So I think that's one of the problems. And so it always strikes me as funny when you see these men who are staunch supporters. And I keep saying men because it really is mostly men. There are a few women, but I'm much more. I understand where they are. I'm a bit more understanding, but it's funny to me when they reach out and kind of Jamar Tisby was one of these men who now they've turned against him, but they originally kind of brought him in because he was safe, and they could put him out there as here's our black man that we're putting forward and we're supporting him and he's going forward. But then as soon as he started saying things that they didn't like, he got pushed out, and now he's like the evil critical race theory. And in fact, he was named as a wolf along with me and Kristen Dumais by Jonathan Lehman and 9 Marks. And Capitol Hill Baptist is right down the road. I was thinking about going and taking a picture in front of it. But I decided not to. Anyway, so yes, so I did. I wanted to put a whole lot more in there about race. And the comments I got back from my editor was, Beth, this is a different book. And so I got in as much as I could, but she was like, your story, really, I'm telling the story of white evangelical women. And then the impact. And one of the other things that got cut was my global impact chapter. And part of that is because with Trade Press, they told me I had 70,000 words. And I don't know if you know how hard it is to only write 70,000 words. It's 72,000 words, not including notes. And so I wanted to do a global chapter that talked about how white evangelicalism was exported. And this is also to the black church. And in fact, a lot of black scholars have talked about how this has been added to their church. And actually, it's a way for them to be accepted by the white church. That if they, accept patriarchy, that it makes them get in, sort of, they're acceptable. So there's a whole lot more to that story. And in fact, it probably is a whole nother book. So
good. That's very helpful. So we'll take questions from the audience. So we'll start here. But as the microphone is coming to you, one more question, which is, I'm just interested to hear you reflect on why this has resonated now. Like, it's, obviously we had one populist phenomenon in 2016 with Trump, yes, right, which had a certain character. This has clearly struck a chord. Yeah. There is, in political context, in Catholic circles, Marian devotion, like in Central America, has had like very significant political impact. It sort of is aligned with populist movements. Yeah. So I'm curious, reflect on why this has struck a chord, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, in some sense, I lucked out with this book when it hit. There's some things you just can't plan. I didn't plan this. But it also came on the heels of the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, and I think that's part of it. I mean, when did the Houston Chronicle come out? I mean, was that barely not even a year before? Beth Moore has done a lot, not intentionally, but her movement but her coming out, and I mean her Twitter threads. I mean, I seriously remember I wrote a blog once where my mom, anyway, my mom's on Twitter, so I always have to be careful. But she told me, she was like, did you know that Beth Moore came out against complementarianism? And we were eating dinner, and I like dropped my fork, and went and read, and that was her letter to my brothers. And I don't know if y'all have read it. It is one of the most powerful things, where she essentially comes out, and she doesn't name names, but we all know who they are. And she says, this is how I've been treated. And she has this phrase in there that I don't know verbatim, but essentially she says, the shepherds, instead of caring for the sheep, were attacking the sheep. And that phrase really struck me because it reminds me of actually a medieval phrase. Petrarch, Francesco Petrarch wrote a letter bemoaning the Avignon papacy in the 14th century, and he said almost exactly the same thing about shepherds, instead of caring, fishers of men who are supposed to rescue men, are eating them instead. And it really struck me because, I mean, that's what essentially she was saying was going on, what the evangelical church was doing to women, what the Southern Baptist Church was doing to women. So that certainly helped. Also, Kristen Dumais' Jesus and John Wayne, which, we didn't plan our books. We really didn't. We didn't have a plan. But my book came out, Kristen's came out in June 2020, and The Making of Biblical Womanhood came out in April 2021. And so she paved the way for my book, for the reception of my book, because we already have an audience that has read her book and been like, oh my gosh, what have we been doing? And then my book helped fill in some of those details even more. So I think maybe those are my best guesses.
Okay, that's helpful. So we'll go here.
Thanks so much. Okay, you can hear me. So as a historian of masculinity, I find that a lot of the, and other things, of course, but I find that a lot of the younger male students in my class will look at me like, oh, she's just a man-hater, maybe, or she's trying to destroy masculine things. And so I usually have to spend a lot of time talking to them about the ways these structures are bad for men, which is also similar to how, with the abolition of slavery, right, that slavery actually makes taskmasters monsters too, right? There was some of that line of thought. And I also try to talk to them about, wouldn't you rather have an equal partner you could be full friends with? And, I try to talk to them about what kind of marriage do you want? So anyway, I was wondering if you could comment a bit more about this line about this being good for men too, and the ways that that can be emphasized as well.
Oh, yeah. No. Some of the conversations I've also had behind the scenes, it's not just women who have reached out to me, but it's men who I have slowly put pieces together. And a lot of these men are actually, they were connected pretty high in circles, like with the Gospel Coalition and these sort of movements. Again, are you listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill? It only, and this is something that I said in the book, and it's something I actually learned from a women's history seminar, because we always talked about why women put up with patriarchy, and a lot of them did it because it worked for them. And so we call it this, as long as you play by the rules, works for you. But what happens when you stop playing by the rules? What happens when you don't live up to those expectations of being a man? And we can think about all of the men who really aren't natural leaders, all of the men who don't really like to go hunt bears, wild at heart. All of the men who don't like to lay on the couch eating nachos and drinking beer while they're, Mark Driscoll. It creates an artificial idea of what it means to be a man that men can't live up to either. That's just it. They can't. They can't live up to it. Women can't live up to it, and men can't live up to it. And the men that don't live up to it, while some of those men can move up into power, most men can't. And so it creates these, it creates marriages where everyone's always having to be artificial, like, saying, this is my role, this is your role, we can't go in each other's lanes, all of that sort of stuff. And so it creates tension on marriages. In fact, this is, one of the things that I have learned too. I've had a lot of therapists that have reached out to me and been like, they've started assigning my book to people, and they started reading it themselves, because they're like, now we understand what's going on in these people's marriages. And so even if it looks like on the outside, what we have done is, instead of letting people be who God has called them to be, we are trying to make people fit into what we think they should be. And God didn't make us this way. And so, there is enough narrative out there that enough evidence out there that this doesn't work for men either, except for a few of them. And in some ways, that's the same with women. There are some women who also benefit from these structures. So, I know that as a white woman, I benefit more than black women from these structures, and women of color. And so, there is something, it's called privilege.
Good. So we'll take a question from back here. I am the keeper of the queue, so do catch my eye. So just in the very back there.
My question is regarding the popular Christian publishing industry. Would the
You should talk to Kristen Dumais.
Would the modern complementarian movement exist without the growth of the popular Christian publishing industry? And if so, what responsibility does it hold?
No, that is, gosh. So what happened in the 70s? Really in the 60s and the 70s, and that's when we see this growth. It's in some ways, if you actually look, let's just look at Baptists. Let's just look at the narrative of Baptists. In the 1960s, we start seeing women being ordained, and the numbers actually start escalating, pretty quickly. And this is also when this fear starts setting in, and we start seeing these, really these coalitions of people trying to change that narrative. They took over. We have Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson, who met in 1967 and planned what became the conservative resurgence to take over all the seminaries. And at the same time, too, they also took over editorial boards of Christian presses. And so like Crossway will not publish anybody that's not complementarian. And Lifeway won't publish anyone who goes against the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And so all of these, so they controlled, and if you think about Lifeway, it controlled the Baptist narrative for decades. And that was the Sunday school material, the Bible translation. That's what I go into in chapter 5, talking about the ESV, which has gotten me in so much trouble. But it was really shocking to me that people didn't know that story. And this was a plan. It really was a plan. So, I think the Christian publishing industry is very much a part of the story. I think they are culpable for what has happened. However, at the same time, they were also duped too. This is it, is that people believe this is gospel. And that's what's happened. They believe it's gospel. So a lot of people, I think, really are in this because they think it's the only way. Some people, however, know better.
So we'll go there, and then we'll zigzag, and then there. 1, 2, 3. And don't worry, I'll move my way over this one.
Hi. So I think one of the issues or challenges in writing this book is kind of coming to a common definition of terms. So if you ask a lot of different church leaders, writers, thinkers, what does patriarchy mean, or what does complementarianism mean, you might get a lot of different answers or versions of what those two terms mean. So how did you deal with that in terms of reaching a common or what you think the definition of those two terms should be?
Yeah.
And as a related subset, complementarian, some people might frame it as a hierarchical term, or some might frame it as a distinctive term, that genders are distinctive. And so how would you respond also to that issue of hierarchicalism versus distinctiveness between the genders?
Yeah. So I'm a professor. I teach undergrads. So one of my jobs in teaching undergrads is to take a lot of these theories and all of these different nuances and make them explainable in a 35-minute lecture. So that's essentially what I did with complementarianism. And a lot of people, I got some responses. People were like, well, you didn't quote the Danvers statement. And I was like, so what I did is I boiled them down. What do they mean? What's the bottom line of what's going on here? And whether you call it hierarchical, whether you call it distinctive, at the bottom line, women are not allowed to do the same things as men. And that those things keep women out of decision-making. Those things keep women from, economically speaking, earning as much money as men. Those things keep women from having a voice in theology the same as men. Go look at the ESV translation board. It's all white men. I think there's like a token woman somewhere on there. I haven't looked. Maybe the ESV Study Bible has a couple. It has a African pastor. But mostly, this is who it is. And so women are excluded from all of these spaces. And so I summarized it really that what complementarianism is. And complementarianism was a word that was made up in 1987. And it was made up at a hotel outside of Wheaton. And it was, I'm sorry, that's a story. It's a true story. But the reason it was made up was because they thought patriarchy was too negative. And there was actually a big argument for a while between some of these guys because some of them were like, well, patriarchy is what we're really doing, so why don't we just call it that? And I was like, well, that's fair. But that's so we have to think about this too. So what's the bottom line? And that's really what I was trying to do. So my whole first chapter is on the creation of patriarchy, the beginning of patriarchy. I don't remember what I called it. But there's a famous text written by a woman named Gerda Lerner whose book is The Creation of Patriarchy. And so I was jumping from her. But the whole first part is kind of showing how no matter what you call it, the bottom line is that women are under men, and that there is no way for women to have access out. I mean, they are really cut off from decision making in the church. And the reason that they do this it doesn't matter what you call it, or if you go to evangelical churches that support this narrative, they mostly quote the same 7 verses. And that's it. And so they're interpreting, and in fact, then they go back and use those verses to reinterpret Genesis. And you can follow this. You can follow this in the theological narrative. And the reason they did that is because if patriarchy is a consequence of the fall, which pretty much everyone else has argued, then that means it's bad. And why are we why are we trying to live in the curse? So they have to invent a narrative that it is before the fall, that it's written to God's grand design, which leads us to Trinitarian heresy. And so all of that is because theologically, they have a very narrow source space, if you want to use it that way. And it's also a source space that hits a lot of walls, both theologically as well as historically. And especially when you compare it with what is going on in the rest of the non-Christian world. So I did simplify. But it's also sort of what I did with Arianism. Arianism is so complicated. There's so many different versions, and you can say, well, you're only a part Arian, semi-Arianism, whatever. But at the end of the day, Arianism says that Jesus is subordinate to God the Father. Jesus is created being. And so anything that fits that narrative you can lump under Arianism. So is that a little bit helpful? Maybe? Yeah.
Good. So we'll go here in the middle.
I was hoping you'd go a little bit deeper about the translation of the Bible, and was wondering what the effects are of different translations on gender roles, and then if you're willing to share what translation you believe does justice to the original Hebrew and Greek texts.
Okay. So I don't know if you're going to like my answer, but I will tell you that one of the people that I've gotten to know through this whole process, who has now become a good friend, is Scott McKnight. And I really like Scott McKnight. And Scott McKnight and I did a podcast on this with The Pastor and the Philosopher Go Into a Bar. That's the name of their podcast. They're actually really fun guys. But we did a whole podcast on this translation issue. I also wrote a couple of blog posts highlighting some of Scott's work, a new translation that he's working on. So you can find more information about it that way. But this is a story. The first chapter that I wrote for the Making of Biblical Womanhood was chapter 5. And it was because I was teaching my women's history course that semester. And that is a big part of what I teach in that women's history course. And so I essentially wrote it. So the student who fell asleep in that chapter really did fall asleep in my class. He was a good student, but he had a sleepy problem, especially during, those of you at Baylor, during Sing. A lot of students sleep during class during Sing, but nonetheless. So I have found that my students have very little understanding of how Bible translations are made. And so my job, part of what I have tried to do, is to help them understand how translations have been made without causing them to fear that they can't believe in the Bible. And so I've been doing this for a long time with them, kind of showing. So one of the things I always say, and Scott McKnight also has verified that this is accurate, 90 to 95% of all English Bible translations within Orthodox that we would do with a lowercase o are pretty much the same. So so the ESV is not a bad translation. It's 90 to 95% the RSV. I mean, seriously, all they did was change the RSV. And where they changed the RSV is what matters. And they changed it mostly in places regarding church leadership and women. It's mostly it. And so what I always tell people is know who translated your Bible. And they tell you in the introduction, we never read introductions. Go read the introduction to your Bible. It tells you who the translators are, tells you where you can find more information about them. And it often tells you what their goals were. And so you can go, so everybody, another saying is every translator is a traitor, because it is really impossible to take a dead language, the Aramaic, and even the New Testament, Greek, etc. But it's really hard to take languages completely out of their culture, especially ones that aren't spoken as much, and all languages evolve, and then try to understand them in our modern terms. And Scott McKnight said something really that made a lot of sense to me. He said, part of the problem with our English Bible translations is we have tried to make them too comfortable to our world, instead of letting them sit in the first century world. And so he actually prefers translations that leave a lot of that discomfort, that this is a foreign world that I am walking into. And in some ways, I think that might help, actually, if more of our translations were like that, because when we read them, like we read the newspaper, well, we don't read newspapers, like you read your daily blog posts, that it makes it seem like, it makes it seem like the natural flow. And so you can even think, like in Ephesians 5, what the ESV does is it separates the verse between, submit to each other as to the Lord, and wives submit to your husband. And that's an artificial separation. And it changes the meaning of the text. So know who translated your Bible and why they did it. I use multiple Bibles. For my own personal, I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up on the NIV. I still like the NIV. I like the NIV 2011. I also have my old TNIV, except for my husband started preaching from it, so I lost it. And I also like the NRSV. I use it a lot. I also use the KJV 1611 a lot because it's a cheat sheet for the Vulgate for me. So I use it a lot.
Yeah, that's good. So we'll go here, and then other questions.
My answers are too long, right?
You're doing great. You're killing it.
Thank you. So first, my sister in Ohio is super jealous that I'm hearing you. She says that she loves you, and she, anyways. So I'm. Thank you so much for everything you've said. So here's my question: what did Christians in medieval times do about gaslighting? So I really appreciate your continual references to
You should go read the Inquisition records.
That's kind of a crazy thing to say. I just heard an interview last night on Fresh Air with Mel Brooks about, his, the Inquisition. It's kind of not kosher, but it's really great. But anyways, I really appreciate what you said. So, but seriously, like, there is a reality to, I've been unfortunately in a situation, all your continual references to Mars Hill have unfortunately resonated because I've worked for a Driscoll-like individual. Yep. And so what do you do when all the women are spinning out and you sound like lunatics because no one understands what it means, like that you say stuff and you've been made to feel crazy? What do we, and I know that, you're a historian and you're a researcher, so I'm asking for a lot out of this question, but what do we do about the gaslighting?
So one of the things that I think my book has helped do that I didn't really expect is that it has brought women together who are sharing their same experiences. And I think that community, that community is powerful. And one of the things, if you're in a church where you experience something like that, go find other women and ask them what their experiences are. Not all of them may have experienced it. You don't want to feed them stuff, but ask them what often what you find is that somebody else has experienced it too, but they don't want to tell anyone because they're, because they have been told that they're misinterpreting it, that they're crazy, etc. But if you find somebody else who the same thing has happened to, and then you can find somebody else, you can grow those communities. And I am firmly convinced, it sounds scary, but the reason patriarchy continues is because women keep letting it continue. There are choices we can make. And and the only, I mean, I am a social historian, y'all, so when I boil everything down to economics, it's, part of that's it. But if people don't go to churches won't be able to continue. Though, I mean, I don't want to pull the plug. I mean, this is a hard thing. People ask me all the time, like, when should I leave? And I'm like, I probably wouldn't have left if we hadn't been thrown out. Because I believe that ideas matter, and that by being on the inside, you can have a lot of influence. I mean, in that youth group we were in, we had a lot of women who actually have gone on to the ministry, even being in a complementarian church like ours, because they were in our youth ministry, and that was a lot of good. And I probably would have kept doing that because it mattered. But so people ask me, when should I leave? And I think that's a matter of personal conscience when to leave. But I also think that if women work together, that we can change some of this and find men who also, because men have been gaslit too. I mean, Mars Hill. So, yeah.
Okay. So over here.
Hi, I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, thank you.
I wonder if what you're talking about, and actually you are paving a way for this to happen. It seems as if you're lifting up, let's not let Christianity be a transaction, but transformational. And I really think that's what your book sounds like it's calling us to do, and I want to encourage you in that. That's what we need to hear.
Thank you.
So I'm a West Coast transplant and a graduate of Fuller Seminary, and Dr. David Scholler was one of my professors who I loved and adored, who taught on women, church, and history. He spoke a lot about what I've read in your book. It's 23 years later. I've been in ministry for 23 years as a pastor. I'm facing the same things that I did 23 years ago. And now I'm serving in a church in the South, in Richmond, Virginia, the head of the Confederacy that has a whole level, and I'm a missiologist, so I'm trying to understand, what is your charge to us? What is your word?
I am just an academic.
No, I think you have...
But you did never expect to be an activist.
I know. Right. But I think you have a word of encouragement for us, and I would love to hear that from you.
I can do that. I can do a word of encouragement. So this is something that has really been hard for women who have been in ministry and who have watched these changes happen, because what we know is that after around 2000, things got harder for women in ministry. I mean, there was a hard turn. And so it's not that complementarianism, it's not that it's new, but it took a hard turn. And really, and it's through all of these networks, all of these teaching networks, the rise, the huge rise of John Piper, and a lot of those networks associated, and the ESV. The ESV is like the third most circulated Bible. So anyway, so all of those things really have worked together to make where women were moving forward that we started going backwards, and which is really discouraging. However, right now, and people have asked me, I mean, right now what you are seeing is a surge of these strong, faithful Christians who have the academic skill set to expose what has happened. And I mean, I always shy away from providential history, but I think God's doing something. I can't explain it in any other way. And just like working together, all of these books are working together. I mean, this is why they're coming out swinging. This is why they're coming out swinging right now. But so I think the tide is shifting. And so I think it's a movement that, a time that we can move forward.